Okay, great. So let's get back to ISA 62443, especially 3-2, our friend.
Yep.
How do you define the system under consideration in a real OT environment?
See, as I mentioned earlier, this is the very first step when you follow the methodology of that particular standard itself. And it can be quite challenging. In my view, the first mistake is that, to define the system only by the name of the application or the platform or the vendor solution. When we are defining the system under considerations, we need to start with the operational function. So, what function are we protecting? We need to start with that particular question. Is it signaling? Is it tunnel management? Is it a water treatment? Is it a pumping? Is it a power management or any other control function, right? So we need to start with that particular basic question. Now, once we understand the function, then we can ask what assets are needed to deliver that function, right? It could be cyber physical assets or other assets, and they can include like central servers, operator workstations, engineering workstations, controllers, field devices, network infrastructure, your historians, uh, and so on and so forth. So the important point is that the system is often bigger than the obvious asset itself. The main control platform may only be part of the picture. The operational function may also depend on shared services or communication infrastructure. So we need to take that into account as well. So if we define the scope of this system too narrowly, and I discussed this earlier as well, we may secure the obvious system, but we may miss the pathways that could actually create the risk. I'll give you an example, right? So let's say a team may define the system under consideration as only the Scada platform or the control application, for instance, right? But the operational function may also depend on field devices, communication networks, backup infrastructure, identity services, and interfaces to the enterprise systems, for instance. Now, if those are excluded, the assessment may miss the actual attack path that an adversary may take and cause the consequence, right? And this is why the Part 3-2 standard asks us to identify the SUC parameter and access points. So access points are very important. They tell us where the electronic information, the user personas, the vendors, the maintainers, the external systems can cross the boundary of the system. And this is where I think the data flows are very important to understand as well. We need to understand what data moves in and out of the system, which industrial protocols are being used, which zones or external systems are connected, and whether the communication is necessary and controlled, right? Now, so my practical approach is start with the question of what is the function, then map the assets that support that function, then identify the boundaries related to those particular assets, identify the access points and the data flows, and then you can document your assumptions and dependencies, because it's always the case that you'll never get the full picture, right? There will be some things that you will miss, and in real assessments, assumptions are not to be treated as a weakness, as long as they are documented and validated where possible, because you can always revisit them as you get more evidences along the journey, right? And ideally, you do this exercise, with thorough workshops with your OT engineers, with your operations team, your network architects, your system service providers, integrators, or the maintainers, right? So all these representatives will provide you that particular picture in defining the system under consideration. And see, if you do this particular part or this particular step properly, the rest of the risk assessment becomes much stronger. But if you do this poorly, everything that comes downstream, defining your zones, defining your conduits, coming up with the risk scenarios, it all becomes very weak then. So this is a very, very important consideration uh, that risk assessors need to, take when you start off with this 3-2, you know, methodology and defining that SUC.
Uh, have you seen this? Have you seen people make this mistake and focus only on parts instead
It's
of the
very
whole?
common. Yeah, it's very common. It's very common. Yeah, what you will see is you'll depend on a system architecture diagram of a particular control system, and we see that okay, these are the particular systems that are connected to it, but you might often see that some of the external connectivity parts are missing. Some vendor access parts are missing from that access points, for instance. Some external dependencies or not dependencies, for instance, dependencies on shared services, for instance, that your infrastructure would be. So things like, for instance, certificate management or active directory or DNS or anything of that sort that you're dependent on, that might be missed within that particular context. So you need to form a good view of the entirety, so you can understand then the attack paths that an adversary can actually take.
But do you think it's a very tough job to understand
It
the
is.
whole system,
It is. It is. It is. It is.
and it's time
And,
consuming?
and see,
Yeah.
and of course,
Mm.
you have a very valid point there, because all these assessments are very time bound. Right? You'll get into an organization, you might get 4, 5, 6 weeks, let's say, for instance, to create an initial draft, of the assessment. And if you're stuck in this particular first step for too long, then you might miss the opportunity. But yes, again, and hence again, you might hear me use this word again and again. We need to have a pragmatic lens and a pragmatic view here. And again, a lot of inputs can be used here. You can
Yes.
use your system design specifications, you can use your architecture artifacts. And sometimes what I feel is, uh, when you get into these particular workshops, they will give you a clearer picture. Sometimes just reading the documents or getting those artifacts, specification artifacts, might not give you the full picture. But having those conversations in a risk workshop might, you might be you'll be surprised how much information you can get actually if you direct those workshops in the right manner.
Nice. So this brings us that you have to, like you said, you have to be good with the humans and talk with them, and instead of
Definitely.
relying. Yes.
Definitely. And as you're dealing with people that might not be coming from a cyber background, right? Particularly when you're talking to the OT engineers or the control systems SMEs and stuff. So you might want to uh, develop a good rapport by sort of speaking their language, and normally it does help. If you can do your homework, go into those conversations, and uh, speak their engineering language, about the control systems and stuff, that helps.
Yes.
And also, you should be a good listener.
Yes. Yes.
that
Like
that
my
helps
friend,
a lot.
he's Aaron Crow. He has a podcast, and I've had him as a guest, and he had me as a guest as well. He said in
Yeah.
America, what they do, they buy donuts and coffee, and they go sit with the engineers and
uh,
those people.
well, to be honest, the coffee culture is great here in Australia as well.
All right,
So yeah, that's a good discussion avenue where you can
make them
do that.
happy.
And
We'll talk.
yes.
Yes.
Buy them a coffee and sit with them, and it's a big culture out here. in Australia.
Yes.
Yes.
Because you remember 10 years ago or 5 years ago maybe, when when everybody was complaining that there is no good relationship between the cybersecurity and the OT people. There was always
A
like
friction. But it has changed. I think, and the reason being, what I feel is that, cyber awareness has, you know, increased a lot in the past few years. So, people have started to realize now that the cyber related incidents are not only relevant to the banking and the financial sectors now, right? It, people, when they're looking at these wars going on, they can actually see the cyber warfare that comes into play, and how critical infrastructures are being attacked. And Ukraine provides us some great examples there, with the nation state actors attacking their energy utilities and stuff. So the OT engineers, and of course, everyone has started to become more aware of, that these threats are real. And when the nation state adversary is actually attacked, they will go for your critical infrastructure,
yes.
basically.
So, like you said, they are now convinced it's not imaginary. It's not
it's
fiction.
not imaginary. That's
it's
true.
real. It's real.
That's true. That's true. That's true.
Yes.
This has changed, in the past, I would say 4 to 5 years, definitely.
Yeah, very much. So let's talk about zones and conduits. I know they are friends and very popular in the ISA 62443, the zones and conduit. What are they, and why they are important, and how do you apply them practically in a
See, yes. So once you've defined the system under consideration, once you have done that
Yes.
particular part, right, the next step is, performing the um, initial cyber risk assessment, which will give you a high level view of the systems and, the consequences that can occur. And then the conversation about zones and conduits comes into play, which helps us organize that particular system into a practical security architecture, right? And I think the easiest way to explain it is this: zones help us decide what should be grouped together, right? What assets, what systems should be grouped together. And conduits helps us decide how those groups should communicate. So that's the easiest explanation, that I can give here. Now, uh, a zone should represent a group of assets that share something meaningful. Maybe their operational functionality, maybe similar security requirements, or maybe similar risk exposure, for instance, similar access requirements, or maybe a similar responsible organization, for instance. So a zone would actually represent those group of assets. Now, a conduit would represent communication between those zones, and that communication needs to be understood and controlled. So you need to be answering questions like, okay, what data is flowing between those two zones? What protocols are used? Who initiates the connection? Is that conduit being monitored? Uh, is that communication actually required? So these are the sort of questions basically that you start to answer when you're defining those conduits itself. And this is where the zones and conduits concept becomes very powerful, because it helps us move away from generic statements that we need to do network segmentation, and it gives us a more sequenced path towards what needs to be separated and why it needs to be separated, and what controls should exist at the boundary itself of those particular groups of assets, right? So again, what needs to be separated, why it needs to be separated, and what controls should exist at the boundary, right? So these would be the questions, that you would get answered with the establishment of these zones and conduits. Now, in real environments, uh, This is extremely important because risk is often introduced through connectivity. The individual systems may be important, but the conduits between them are often where excessive trust becomes very visible. So let me give you an example. Um, a vendor access path into an OT environment. They might be supporting that system, uh, and it should not be treated as just an other network connection. From a zone and conduit perspective, it may need to be modeled as a very distinct access path with its own zone where the communication is landing and its own security requirements for the conduits, right? That's one example. Another example could be a safety related system, right? Because if safety related assets are mixed with non safety assets, then we need to think carefully about whether they can be logically or physically segregated or separated. If they cannot be separated, then the whole zone may need to be treated as a safety related zone. And that's one of the aspects that this standard calls about. Uh, Another example could be about devices that connect temporarily, right? Like maintenance laptops, for instance, or portable engineering workstations, or USB devices, for instance. Now, since these devices may have been exposed to other networks or environments, so from a risk perspective, they may need their own treatment, right? And their own security requirements from perspective of zones and conduits than being casually included in a trusted control zone, which will have a less security requirement. So these are some of the elements that you would have to think about. uh, i'll I'll give you another example, and it's a very emerging use case in the context of the cloud or AI enabled services
That's good.
that are servicing OT environments, right? Now, many organizations that I see are starting to send their operational data to cloud platforms, right? And there are
Yes.
different edge use cases for analytics, for predictive maintenance, for
Yes.
asset performance management, for AI assisted decision making. Now, these use cases can bring value, right, from
Yep.
a zones and conduits perspective. They would also require you to create new trust boundaries
Yes.
because of the external communication paths. And 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 see, the question here is not, is cloud good or bad? I think that will warrant another podcast. We
Yeah.
can discuss that
Oh,
sometime. But the question here is, what data is leaving the OT environment? Where
mhm.
is it going? Who has access to that data? Can anything actually come back into the
Mm.
ISCS environment, and what security controls exist across that conduit, right? And these are use cases that are being now commonly employed because of the advancements in the AI, in the predictive maintenance world, and all those edge use cases that I spoke about, right? So this will warrant a, a view of a, a different mindset of how you are then defining your zones and the conduits and stuff, right? So in a nutshell, for me, zones and conduits are where risk assessments become architecture, because
Wow.
this is where we start to look at it from architecture lens, because
Yes.
they will define your trust boundaries, they will define your communication paths, uh, and your monitoring points as well,
Mm.
right?
Nice.
So yeah, so that's a view that 3-2 also provides of zones and conduits.
Nice. And you just mentioned very good point about the remote connection that is coming from a vendor, and you have to uh, not consider it as another connection, but also you have to make it consider the zone as well, right? Does that mean, like, my podcast with and with one of my guests, he said remote access makes you or oblige you sometimes to implement other controls such as the zones, and in order for the remote access uh, So you by doing remote access, you are hitting other controls and other.
That is very right, because as you rightly said, right, when you are implementing a remote connection pattern, for instance, a remote access pattern,
Yes.
then you would start to think about, okay, when this connection comes, where does it need to land? And for that, you would actually create a zone into the DMZ space. And I'll give you an example. You
Yep.
will bring in multi-factor authentication as a control there. You might
Yep.
bring in a jump host as a control there. You might bring in a gateway as a control over there, right? And some extra level of authentication and monitoring that
Yes.
you might want to for that particular zone. So it starts to answer some of those questions then
Yes.
very
I see.
evidently.
Also, when you talked about the architectural side or the skill that you have to apply on zones and conduit, do you think people who do risk assessment, they are like different skill, different people, and then when it comes to architecture, there will be must be other people with special skills like architecture, or a guy who doing risk assessment, can he handle doing also the architecture?
See, I guess it will depend person to person and with their experience, to be honest.
Yes.
I don't think I can give a blanket statement there that
Yeah.
a person can do it or not. But I do feel uh, a risk assessment requires a different sort of expertise, and an architectural design landscape defines a different set of expertise.
Of course, yes.
Right? Um, so yeah, I think it does help. When you get a person basically who's cross-skilled, in both the risk and the architecture aspect, because if you go back and look at the 62443 model, right, where it says that when you where they talk about the cybersecurity life cycle, and the cybersecurity life cycle starts from the assess, design, and maintain, right? So that's the cybersecurity life cycle that the ISO 62443 talks about. Now, the assess part is where you perform these risk assessments and provide
Yes.
these outputs of the risk assessment. Then you have the design part. So the focusing on the design part from the ISO 62443 actually indicates that that requires a level of skill set basically when
Yes.
you are actually interpreting those risk assessments and then translating them into security architecture, patterns, roadmaps, capability roadmaps, right? So all these actually come into play basically for the organization then, right? So so yeah, I don't know if I answered your question there, but yeah, I think
Yes.
it
Yes.
you require skill sets in both areas basically.
So by saying this, you're saying, I mean, now we are talking to the people who are improving their skills and want to get the job or get into auto security. By learning the ISA 6443, that doesn't mean that you will be able to accomplish like the design phase or the control phase or the those skill set. The ISA 644 will not teach you this. You have to get them from someone else.
You definitely need to have a real world experience there, right? Because these architectural artifacts, for instance,
Mm.
or other artifacts or strategy roadmap that you might create after this, for instance, right, based out of the risk assessment itself. Yes, you definitely require other sort of experience. But having said that, utilizing the 62443 standard, it is always a reference point for you because it helps you easily understand, okay, what controls we are talking about here basically, right? And then you can then convert those control sets into an architectural pattern or a roadmap itself. So there is a link basically between both. You can always use the 643 standard as your reference point basically when you are creating those particular artifacts.
So yeah, like, so you need different skills, different experience in order to apply this reference course.
Definitely.
So this is like, I'm talking now to people who want to get into OT security. Studying the standard alone is not enough. You need maybe other certificates or other skills and other
And
experience.
I'll
Yes.
give you a personal example, right? Um, uh, and I'll give you an example of creating cybersecurity strategy for an organization, right?
Okay.
And those are normally uh, coming out when you perform these risk assessments. Then you need to go to the executives, basically, that once you have got the agreement or the asset approvals and everything, you know you want to go back to the executives, or the leadership teams of that particular organization, and then present them that, guys, this is our strategy of how we are going to achieve this, right? And when it comes to the strategy, you will have multiple elements to define in that strategy. You would cover, you would need to understand some project management elements, for instance, from perspective of, for instance, if you want to do an agile way of uh, uh, achieving that particular strategy, how would you go about doing that? What will be the budget required? How many resources you might need, right? What will be the current state and the target state when we have done this? And I'm not talking from current state or target state purely from perspective of the SLT levels, but from perspective of the capabilities that we are introducing in the environment, right? So it it requires definitely an understanding of how you present these particular strategies in front of boards, for instance, and how you get the buy-in, for instance, right? So I'm just giving you
Maybe
some
we should
examples.
make an episode on how to be a consultant, and you can teach us if you want to share your maybe
Most
your
definitely.
experience. How
Anytime.
what language do you need to learn? How to communicate? How to transfer the skills into consultancy, stuff like that. That would
Definitely.
be really interesting, and I'm really looking forward if you approve this, because you are like a living example. So because you are a consultant, so anything you say is based on reality. Okay, I'm really getting excited with your talk, because what you talking is very practical and very true. So that's why I'm really enjoying with you. That's why I'm asking you questions, because I'm not
Thank you.
bored. I'm
Likewise.
really happy. I'm really happy to have you. Really,
Likewise, Dr. Sulaiman.
sure. How do you move from risk matrix or risk register to meaningful OT security decisions?
Yes, and I think we've touched on this subject as well while we're discussing, right, around creating the right sort of artifacts and stuff. And see, for me, right, moving from a risk matrix, which we get as an output of the entire risk assessment, that okay, these are the particular risks, and you will have these fancy risk frameworks that organizations can, would employ. So with that, having that risk matrix alone would not satisfy basically how you move forward. Now, moving from that particular risk matrix to meaningful OT security decisions means asking a few practical questions, right? After this risk assessment is done. Okay. And from that perspective, what is the scenario that we considered? What is the consequence? What controls already exist? Right? What is our residual tolerable risk? And then it actually leads you towards the right sort of decision making. Because if you take a step back, right, and look at how we have approached the entire assessment, so far, or the methodology so far, we have gone through the initial risk assessment, then we have come into the detailed risk assessment, whereby you have defined some credible threat scenarios, you have been informed by your threat environment, you you have tried to understand the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities within the environment, right? And then you have assessed the particular consequence that might affect the environment itself, right? And then one element that we have not touched so far is the likelihood element, because that's a very important element to consider when you are doing these risk assessments, right? Particularly when you're doing the detailed risk assessment. And when it comes to likelihood, it can be very difficult in an OT environment to sort of provide that likelihood assessment, because we may not always have perfect data set to make some informed decision, but we can still make a reasoned assessment based on the threat capability, exposure, known vulnerabilities that we know in the environment. Maybe we can take any previous incidents that might have happened in the industry itself, or the attractiveness of that particular target industry, right? We can take all these elements into account to create a likelihood assessment. Uh, we have also by now also considered the unmitigated risk and residual risk. So the unmitigated risk helps us understand how bad the risk could be before cybersecurity countermeasures are considered, and residual risk tells us what remains after existing controls are considered, right? Now, when we have done all this, now it comes to the decision point around what do we want to do with the risk? Do we want to mitigate this risk? Do we want to transfer this risk? Do we want to accept this risk? Or do we want to change the design, for instance, of the system itself? Right? So this is where it would start to translate into a specific action, accountable owner, the time frame required to do this, right? Um, and this is where the we are moving from the maturity to drive the treatment decisions. uh, and it's basically providing us a view of that a risk register is not basically sitting in a risk itself, but it's helping us drive the decisions of what we need to take. I hope that makes sense, because I've tried to sort of give you a structured pathway of how this entire risk assessment methodology of part 3-2 helps us reach those decision points, right? Because
Yes,
we have performed all these elements, and then we are actually then deciding what we want to do with these particular risks. And this is where you actually go down the path of making the right sort of decisions.
very well, very well. It's very clear, and thank you for clarifying this. Even though you mentioned it before, but now it makes more sense by saying it like the way you said. Um, okay, I think let's wrap up now. Once we're done with risk assessment and what to do with it in practice, how we make decisions, can this really how can we make this improve our resilience, the organization resilience by and we want to know also what does resilience really mean in
Yes. Yeah,
OT
good question. Now,
Thanks.
see, the resilience is not only about preventing every attack. So let's make that clear, right? So it's not about preventing every attack vector that you have. It is also about knowing what matters most, what are your critical assets or crown jewels of your organization, for instance, reducing the likelihood of the compromise, right, by introducing controls, monitoring controls, detective controls, and stuff of that sort, limiting the blast radius by doing the right sort of network segmentation so the blast radius is reduced, uh, detecting any abnormal activity, and then responding effectively and recovering safely, right? So this all encompasses resilience, right? So it's not only the prevention, but it encompasses more than that. your detection capability, your recovery capability, your response capability, right? So now, how it helps basically, these particular risk assessments obtain resilience, for an organization. Let's work through some examples. For instance, uh,
Okay.
if a risk assessment identifies that a vendor remote access conduit creates a high residual risk, right? The output should translate into specific actions like we discussed this earlier. We need a stronger authentication. We need access approval workflow. We need a jump host architecture. We need a session recording, right? We need to be logging this into our OT SOC, for instance. So combining all these elements, from that particular risk, you're moving towards a resilience, right? Uh, let's take another example, for instance. Now, if the assessment identifies that supplier managed assets creates exposure, right? It can lead us to influence our future procurement requirements, right? We can actually tell the supplier that, guys, we need those sort of security capabilities, uh, you know, to be supplied with those particular assets, right? It should have a logging capability. It should be supporting the right sort of patches. You should be doing your vulnerability disclosure. You should be giving us hardening guidance. You will have life cycle obligations for that asset, right? So it's moving us towards resilience,
Yes.
right? So uh, so the risk assessment actually then becomes a way of prioritizing your actions, and it helps your organizations avoid you know spreading your investment too thinly and instead focus on the assets and the scenarios that matter most, right? And I think, in the end, my final view is that a good OT risk assessment should produce much more than documentation, as
Yes.
we, alluded to earlier. It should produce better decision,
Mhm.
clearer requirements, stronger architecture, and a practical path towards resilience. And that will
Yes.
come with your strategy and capability roadmaps.
Very
So
clear.
that's my view of how it moves towards resilience. Each risk moves you towards resilience itself.
Very clear. Very clear. And thank you for sharing this. Really, we've learned a lot
Appreciate
from you in this episode, this podcast. Uh, Anything you would like to say before we close the podcast? I know it's quite late now in Australia. It's almost maybe 11 p.m. or
it.
12 p.m. a.m.
Yes. Yes. See, I think my final parting comments would be OT assessments should not be treated as just a compliance exercise. As I said earlier, when we started this podcast, it should help us understand what matters most for the operation and what decisions will reduce the most meaningful risk. Then it becomes much more than a report, right? It becomes a tool for your resilience. So those are my final comments, I guess, in this regard.
Thank you, Engineer Fahad. Really, I really enjoyed the episode with you.
Thank you,
Uh,
Dr. Sulaiman. Pleasure to be here.
the pleasure is mine. Really, really like the episode because it's very practical and very hands-on and to the point. No, not theory. No theory that is not necessary. That's really this is the way I like, and I hope this added some extra information for you, my beautiful guests or my beautiful audience. I hope you learned something today, and I'm sure you learned something today because this is one of the special episodes I've had so far. Thank you, brother Fahad, and sorry for
Thank
keeping
you,
you
Dr.
late. I
Sulaiman.
know it's late. It's
All good.
late.
All good.
The time difference between Australia and Kuwait. So thank you for arranging this and accepting this. Okay, everybody, take care and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.